Yeah, as you can see, it's up there, a consultant. I can't hide from it, I'm afraid, and as Bronwyn already said, already on the coalface. Probably the role of the consultant, as you all know, is a bit piggy in the middle, really. You know, we've got developers, architects, planning consultants, all putting pressure on us, trying to get good designs through. At the same time, we're looking to the local authorities to approve schemes and somehow come up with a strategy in between. So the whole presentation today is really focused on the consultant's perspective, but I will touch a couple of other perspectives as well, developer and lead local flood authority too. So as a quick overview, I'm going to look at what we used to do basically prior to the lead local flood authorities, and then what happened after, once the introduction of lead local flood authorities about 3 years ago now. There's a couple of case studies in there, one not so good, and one hopefully from the lessons that we've learned. And so in between, we're going to look at where the benefits of early engagement are with the LLFA. And finally, if I've got time, hopefully we'll pick up some of the future challenges and opportunities. So what did we do prior to the LLFAs? Well, what did we as consultants do, and what difficulties did we face? Well, we were typically unsure of what would be acceptable to local authorities. We had a rough idea, but to be honest with you, there was no clear guidance. What site investigations were required for outline design versus detailed design, infiltration testing, groundwater monitoring, CCTV surveys. What were the preferred runoff rates of both greenfield and brownfield sites? Were we just going underneath a brownfield site at the existing discharge rate or the current rate that it discharges at? Or were we looking for a 50, 100% betterment? What would the local highway authority adopt? Very often the house developers would want their roads adopted within the scheme. There was a real reluctance to accept permeable paving initially, anything other than traditional highway drainage. There was also limited options for complicated schemes that didn't fit the mould. What happens if half of your site could drain by infiltration and half via the sewer, because that was the only option. And so that solution at the time was really to present several open options, keep these reports very open-ended. We could do this or we could do this. So basically there are lots of ifs. If infiltration is available, if the runoff rate is acceptable, but we can't gain access across third-party land, but the application is for outline only. And maybe we can discharge at the existing rate. Maybe this can be dealt with by condition. Ultimately, what it leads to is uncertainty for all, not just the consultant, developer, lead local flood authority. From the consultants and developers' perspective, this uncertainty basically could end up in a redesign. That's additional costs all round, primarily ends up with a developer, which could have been avoided very early on. There's also uncertainty with the planning conditions at that time. There are often poorly worded examples. Some of the conditions required discharge rates which simply couldn't be achieved, primarily because there were 2 or 3 different strategies within the report, different options, and the local planning authority was expected to make that decision. So there was frustration, delays, and ultimately poor SuD schemes, or as we're terming them, duds. So since the introduction of the LLFAs, well, what benefits have we seen? Well, the first thing is we've got a clear understanding of the requirements now. I mean, no longer have we got this moving target that we're trying to fire at all the time. Bronwyn's already talked about there's robust planning policy. For example, in Kent, they've introduced their drainage and planning policy statement regarding the implementation of SuD, so we can actually start seeing, what we should be trying to achieve. The pre-application advice has also enabled us to deliver functional SuDs now, so we can actually have some of these questions that are answered at an early stage. So I'm going to move on to a not so good case study. It is in Kent, it's at Bromley Football Club, but it's a site that we were involved with originally for the installation of a number of all-weather pitches around the outside of the main pitch. This is the site itself. You can see the main football pitch in the middle. And then you've got, just to the south of that, there's 2 smaller all-weather pitches. And the planning application that actually went forward several years ago was actually to have 2 more all-weather pitches that were permeable and would discharge into the 2 watercourses. Now there's a watercourse and a blind ditch that runs on the western boundary of the site. And I say it's a blind ditch because basically when that car park was put in, prior to when we came to site, there is no connection to the north of to the River Ravensbourne. The second watercourse actually runs around the outside of the pitch itself. And then it passes underneath the clubhouse and the changing facilities through a 450mm culvert before it gets to the triangle at the top, which is is basically another open ditch that then leads on to the River Ravensbourne. We got a phone call from the client to say they changed the planning application slightly. They're also part of the culvert had collapsed as well in the centre of the site, just underneath the clubhouse, and it was unviable, financially unviable, to actually repair that culvert in its form. So they said, it's okay, the scheme has changed slightly, but this is what we're seeing under a relatively low return period event. Well, clearly there's nowhere for that water to go. So they said, well, can we come down and meet the drainage officer? Because they're being very difficult. They're not really understanding that we've got drainage contractors in, and our new changes to the all-weather pitch aren't quite meeting their satisfaction. So this was the changeover period from when the LLFAs were just being introduced. Well, when we turn up, the left-hand side with the triangle is the outfall. The ditch had clearly not been maintained, and this is the onward connection to the River Ravensbourne. But the worrying pictures are the two right-hand ones. The far right-hand one was that field that we just looked at a minute ago. The all-weather pitches had turned into a car park. Quite a considerable size, already compacted, the excavator's on there, and 70 to 100,000 pounds worth of black tarmac coming in the following day to be pushed over the top. You can also see in the middle picture, this was the diversion for the culvert, which is now running straight off into distance underneath the clubhouse. But this one doesn't. We've got a sandbag head wall, we've got no connection, no chambers, no manholes, no cover, and this is just a PVC pipe which does a 90-degree bend underneath the green railings there. I think we can all agree that's a bit of a duds. It then goes across onto this picture where you can then see it carries on towards the car park.
The screensaver's picture.
Okay, jolly good. There we are. Technology. So it then turns 90 degrees and follows along the car park, but again, a 90-degree bend with no chamber. Horrendous. So of course I met the lead local flood authority officer on site about 10 minutes before I'd only just seen this. And this was the developer's view of it's changed slightly. They'd overpumped the car park to get rid of that water, and as far as they were concerned, as long as this culvert pushed water onto the onward ditch, it wasn't their problem. They solved their flooding issues. So clearly we tried to explain initially that an all-weather pitch that was designed to store water and attenuate discharge rates was not quite the same as an impermeable car park. So the drainage solution, without going into it in too much detail, they'd also, just to sort of a point of clarity, where you can see the green line, which is now a proposed swale going through or around the car park, they'd actually infilled the western watercourse as well with the car park and completely removed that. So the solution, again, was still not far from ideal, but there was a lot of discussion with the lead local flood authority on how we did this. But basically, the connection, that culvert was completely removed, the one that goes at 90 degrees. Clearly proper connections put in place, but a permeable surface car park, which actually would provide attenuation and storage before discharging at a restricted rate underneath the existing car park further to the onward culvert. Now, I haven't really got time to go into the details of it, but I'll be happy to sort of elaborate on this a little bit afterwards. But essentially, it was a SuDS scheme that went forward, but certainly not an ideal SuDS scheme. The lead local flood authority were happy. The response that we got is that at least we actually got some reassurance that what we were doing was acceptable. It was okay to complete to install the 450 culvert because it was exactly the same as the one that had already collapsed, so there was going to be no increase in runoff rates. We were also given clear guidance on what else was required. It was to submit a scale plan. Acceptability of the 300mm sub-base underneath permeable surfacing. In this case, they didn't want permeable paving, they wanted permeable tarmac because they didn't want the block paving. And also confirmation of what discharge rates should be. So what benefits then are there of early engagement with the LLFA, not 10 minutes before you've seen the scheme? Well, from the developer's perspective, I said I'd look at different people's perspectives. It minimises unnecessary planning objections. Now, I would say that this was probably a necessary planning objection. But you can see that there was considerable costs had already gone in to put part of that car park in and that drainage system. All abortive work, all of it's going to have to come out again. There was delay to the application process if they'd actually gone in for planning. And obviously this leads to construction delays if this is a housing project. So what benefits is it for the lead local flood authority to engage early? Well, they get to promote the use of well-designed SuD schemes with consultants early on. They get a chance to integrate SuDs at that design stage and also qualify those appropriate discharge rates as well, depending on the area that you're actually in. And also promote, where you can, biodiversity and amenity benefits. So what benefits are there for us as consultants? Well, it's the ability really to provide clear advice to our clients. As I said, it's all about knowing what the rules are. If we can understand what the lead local flood authority want, we can also kind of liaise with the developer and actually say, well, this is what is required to get your planning permission or to move your scheme forward. And it's all about building those good relationships with the LLFA early on. So how do we do that? Bronwyn's already touched on this, but really pre-application advice, and that can either come in site meetings and visits, written advice, either informal advice, just on a quick point of clarity, sometimes is all you need, or maybe a more formal written advice to a strategy that's gone in. But Bronwyn's also mentioned developer forums, which Kent hold. And I'd say these are very, very interesting meetings because it's open to everybody. It's open to the developer, to the consultant, and to the local authority as well. And something that we've taken out of this is really just about how we can smooth that process forward and move it forward with a minimum of delay, I think. So we were asked, for example, to create layout plans. Now, from a consultant's perspective, we'd undertaken a comprehensive strategy. We provided a layout plan showing where the indicative SuDs were to be stored, so whether it's a swale, a pond, and where the connection point was. But what we found out from that developers forum is that really the way Kent would like to see it was a bit more information on that. And that's sort of, it was all in the strategy, but of course it's cross-referencing all the time and mistakes are going to be made, objections that might not have been raised are being pushed forward. So instead, it's quite simple for us to add infiltration rates at the base of the sub-base depth. You know, where are these different SuDs going to be incorporated onto a scheme? Something very small, but something that saved all of us a huge amount of time. So the second case study is hopefully a slightly better example where we've engaged the LLFA very early on. So this is an example really of an existing brownfield site in a small village in Great Chart just outside of Ashford in Kent. Now the top image is an aerial shot showing the location of the, it's this one just here, what was actually a former petrol station. Surrounded obviously by the impermeable forecourt in a very nice sort of Kentish village. Now you can see from the four lower images, that's the site as it stands now. In 2008 the garage was demolished. We're on wheel clay, potential contamination issues, so infiltration pretty much a no-go. The nearest water course is 250 metres outside of the village. There's no surface water sewers. And we know in part that this site discharges to the highway drain that you can see at the front there. But highways weren't accepting that that was the case. We'd also contacted Southern Water because we believe there might be a connection to the foul sewer, because that was the only sewer that was in the area. Southern Water refused to acknowledge that there would be any connection to that sewer. So we've ended up with a site with almost no drainage solution and something very, very difficult. Do we just go back to our developer and say, I'm really sorry, but you know, you're proposing to put 10 houses on this site, but no, just sell the land. It's a car park. Does the village need a car park? Well, I don't think it does, and if it does, it hasn't got any SuDs there. So, didn't go to Tower Bridge, there we are. So, LLFA involvement. The first thing we did was just pick the phone up. We had a conversation with the Kent team and said, you know, are you prepared to meet on site? Would this be the best option? Can we actually go down there and see what the situation was? And what we found is, yeah, when we got on site, the two engineers had a conversation. It found that the existing garage actually did have a connection. It hadn't been picked up on the CCTV survey because because it had just been said that there was no connection at all. Clearly wrong. So in order to move this forward, the LLFA actually wrote a report which was forwarded to Southern Water. And just to pick out the key points in that, that's obviously quite small text, but basically it says that KCC agree that the disposal of surface water into the public foul sewer is likely to be the only viable option at this site, and is considered this would follow the existing drainage regime for the site. But what they've also done is provide recommendations as well to enable us to move some form of strategy forward. So they've come back and said, you know, that we've got to discharge at a restricted rate of 2 litres per second as an acceptable minimum. They've also stated here at the bottom that they're not just saying, okay, we're just going to walk away from this. They've also said, should planning permission be forthcoming, further intrusive investigations of existing drainage features should be undertaken to confirm the full extent of the existing drainage system. But because of those good working relationships that the lead local flood authority have got with a sewage undertaker and others, it meant that this site was accepted. So we've gone from, just as a point of summary, impermeable geology, potential contamination issues, no watercourse, poor existing drainage in a foul sewer, no solution, to now a scheme which features permeable paving, an agreed attenuated rate of discharge to the foul sewer, appropriate pollution control, and it's a scheme that the LPA have just approved, but have also commented on that they've been incredibly grateful that they can actually see the whole stream of correspondence that's gone through to see that this has been investigated properly. Essentially, everybody's happy. Certainly the developer, because they've moved a site forward and hopefully going to reduce the risk of flooding to what is really an eyesore in a very, very nice village. So just finally, to finish then, on some of the challenges and future opportunities. I mean, each site is unique. Nothing's going to change that challenge. And really making a standard approach fit is very, very difficult. But at least with this guidance, we can actually start understanding those rules early on. The client requirements very often vary. I mean, for example, sometimes they're just option sites. Sometimes they're large-scale developers. They're very, very reluctant to put in large-scale above-ground SuDS. Slowly beginning to get a move towards permeable paving on surfacing, but it really is like pulling teeth sometimes. So it's really about trying to sort of educate developers, and we're almost in that good place to do that, but we need that guidance as well to fall back on. Some clients are just simply selling sites on, and they don't care what outrageous SuDS are put forward, but that doesn't help either, because that's just going to get inherited as the planning permission moves forward with conditions. And some developers are retaining sites to build on, and therefore their main concern is maintenance. How is this SuDS scheme that's been put forward going to be maintained? Bronwyn touched on it again earlier. There's a little bit of overlap here, but realistic timescales. But from consultants and developers' perspective, sometimes these aren't always realistic, and developers' perspective timescales aren't always realistic. So an analogy for this one is that we've just finished a very, very detailed flood risk assessment and surface water management strategy. We did a lot of numerical hydrodynamic modelling to quantify a flow path that went through the site. The developer gave us their layout plans, all their fixed layout plans. We designed a SuDS scheme which uses infiltration. Essentially, the development consumes its own smoke. Sent off the draft to the developer. Very, very happy. A week and a half later, Friday morning, we get an answer back that says, yep, super, really happy with the strategy. However, one small glitch is we've changed the scheme. And the second small glitch is we're submitting this afternoon. So leaving us something like 6 hours to change a strategy. Well, clearly it was a fundamental change, and we've said we may be able to get this to you in a week. Their approach was we're still submitting regardless, as quick as you can get us that information. But clearly what it doesn't do is allow us that time to liaise with the LLFAs again. But because we've done that early liaison, the lessons learned from this is at least we understand the parameters that we're working to. And although the scheme has changed quite radically, we can still know what goal we're aiming at, and we can still actually fit the SuDS around that. So just a couple more. Changes in personnel are always a challenge as well. Building those good relationships with whether it's the consultants themselves and our staff, turnover and change. The same with LLFAs, and Bronwyn touched on it earlier, planning officers as well. There's always those challenges, strengthening those working relationships across organisations, IDB, EA, sewage undertaker, LLFAs, LPAs. It's all really, really helpful. Again, it's a challenge, but it's moving in the right direction. And the final couple of points is the enforcement of SuDS. Now, I've highlighted this one in orange because I think this is going to be one of the future opportunities, but a real challenge as well. So what do we do when we get the first site, the Bromley Football Club site, and we've turned up and there's already thousands of tonnes of hardcore in there? How is that to be enforced? I'm kind of pleased to see now that we're beginning to see conditions that are coming through that are saying, you know, we want to see these signed off. We're not just going to accept, another drainage strategy that's coming through. So really, it's all about that clear guidance and feedback, but it is still early days. It has only been 3 years, and to be perfectly honest with you, although we've done hundreds of different strategies in the past 3 years, we really haven't seen a huge number built out. Now, whether that is because developers are holding back land banks, schemes are changing when they get through to the later stages, but I think we'll start seeing these schemes come through in the next few years. But at the moment, there's a lot of, I suppose, legacy schemes from before the LLFAs were there. So it's going to be a real challenge to see what happens with these new sites. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Simon. I'll ask him just to hold on for a few minutes as well. And again, if there's any quick points of clarification that you'd like to ask Simon whilst he's still here, then we'll take some questions from the floor. There's one just here. If you just wait for the microphone to arrive, again, say your name and where you're from. Blue shirt.
Just a quick point. You mentioned about these new proposals. They're in the UK. I don't come from the UK, but what is the authority that polices this? So you've said how do you actually ensure that the correct things are done? Is there a policing authority?
That's a very, very tricky question. There is planning enforcement. Typically over here you would, obviously you would go for planning permission. Your permission might be granted, and it'd be granted maybe with a series of planning conditions attached, and one of those conditions may be to ensure that the drainage system, the sustainable drainage system that's been approved at planning, is built to that standard, or further details are provided in terms of a detailed design. But as Bronwyn pointed out earlier, again in some of her examples, developers will change because at this time there isn't any enforcement that I've seen. Its resources are very, very scarce, and so I haven't seen people going on the ground. Now, there may be people in this room that can correct me in terms of planning enforcement, but I think until that time where building control, for example, will oversee a building midway through construction, they're not tasked at the moment to sign that building off in terms of sustainable drainage.
Because we have a pre- and post-construction agreement, essentially, and pretty much the same. There's not a great deal of policing. However, if it ever went wrong, the authorities would beat somebody over the head with it, massive. But that's too late. That's all retrospective.
I think a lot of the liability at the moment is almost relying on the integrity of the drainage designer, in the fact that they're looking at their PI, and so they'll come back and say, well, if we haven't designed it in accordance with X, Y, and Z, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the drainage system that they put in could be suitable and could work, but it may be very, very different, for example, from it may be a cellular storage unit attenuating the discharge rate, but it's not the agreed wetland that went through the planning system.